"This poem is for my deceased father," the little girl said, her voice trembling just enough to fill the silent church. In the back row, a man sat perfectly still, his hands gripping a white cane as tears he couldn't see began to trace paths down his face. Because he was the father she thought was dead. You see, sometimes a man has to lose everything the world values, his empire, his power, his very sight, just to finally see what truly matters. This is the story of how a billionaire the world had already mourned was brought back to life by his own daughter's eulogy. It's the story of how a little girl's words managed to build something far taller and stronger than any skyscraper her father ever could, a bridge between what was lost and what could still be found. Before we dive in, if you believe in the power of forgiveness and second chances, do me a quick favor and hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. I also want to know your thoughts in the comments. What do you think is more powerful, a billionaire's fortune or a child's words? I'd love to know where you stand. Thank you. Now, to understand how a father could be a ghost at his own memorial, we have to go back to the beginning. Because every impossible reunion starts with a choice that tore everything apart. Before he was the blind man in the back of a church, he was Arthur Vale, a name etched onto half the skyline of the city. He didn't just own buildings, he owned the sky they occupied. From his penthouse office, the city looked like a circuit board he had designed, a network of lights and power that answered only to him. At 35, he had a mind that saw 10 moves ahead in business and a heart that had forgotten how to feel one moment in the present. His celebrations were hollow affairs, filled with champagne that tasted like minerals and laughter that echoed with transactional emptiness. He'd stand on his balcony, the wind whipping at his $1,000 suit, and feel nothing but the cold grip of his own success. He had everything money could buy, but nothing he actually needed. Have you ever known someone like that? Someone who won the world but lost themselves in the process? Then he met Lena. She wasn't part of his world. She was a literature teacher from a small town, a woman who smelled of old books and rainy afternoons. Where Arthur saw assets and liabilities, Lena saw poetry and potential. She didn't look at his towers. She looked into his eyes and saw the boy from the south side he'd tried so hard to bury. She taught him that greatness without gentleness is just noise. With her, the silence didn't feel empty, it felt full. For the first time, Arthur felt the ice around his heart begin to thaw. He was building an empire, but with Lena, he felt like he was building a home. But empires have a cost. A multi-billion-dollar deal in Asia emerged, the kind of legacy-defining project he'd always craved. It required him to be gone for months, maybe longer. "It's just for a little while," he promised her, his voice confident, masking the flicker of doubt in his soul. "When I get back, it will all be worth it." Lena looked at him with an unbearable sadness in her eyes, a look that said she knew something he didn't. She didn't argue. She didn't fight. She just went quiet. Her silence was the last thing he ever heard from her. He chose the deal. He chose the noise over the quiet. It was the single greatest mistake of his life. Months later, somewhere over the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, the left engine of the Vale Industries private jet sputtered, coughed, and burst into a plume of fire. The sky tore open. Alarms screamed a final useless warning as the plane spiraled violently toward the dark water below. The world held its breath. News channels broke into every program with the same shocking headline: "Billionaire Arthur Vale's jet vanishes. Presumed dead." The empire he built went on without him. The world mourned the titan, the visionary, the symbol of success. And in a small apartment above a post office, a young woman named Lena held her newborn daughter, Maya, and whispered a tearful goodbye to a man she believed was gone forever. But Arthur wasn't gone. He was pulled from the wreckage by the weathered hands of fishermen off a remote coast, the sole survivor of a crash that should have claimed everyone. He awoke days later in a sterile, quiet hospital room, not to the light of a new day, but to an endless, suffocating darkness. The explosion had taken his sight. The doctors called him a miracle. But as he lay there, wrapped in bandages and a silence deeper than any he had ever known, Arthur didn't feel like a miracle. He felt like a ghost. He was alive, but the man he used to be was dead. And as the thought settled into his soul, he whispered to the empty room, "Maybe it's better this way." He had no idea how true that was. A week later, a kind nurse came into his room to read him the day's news, her voice soft and gentle. She folded the paper, completely unaware of who her patient truly was. "Such a tragedy," she sighed, her voice filled with pity. "It says here the whole world is mourning the loss of that famous billionaire, Arthur Vale. A true visionary, gone too soon. Arthur didn't move. He didn't breathe. He just listened, a blind man in a hospital bed, as the world read the obituary of a man he no longer recognized, a man who had traded everything that mattered for a sky he could no longer see. He was alive, but to the world, and to the woman he left behind, he was dead. And the question is, what does a man do when he's given a chance to start over, but the world thinks he's already gone? While Arthur Vale was a ghost to the world, Lena was building a universe for one. Their home was a tiny one-bedroom apartment perched above the town's post office, a place where the walls were thin but their laughter was thick enough to keep out the cold. Here, poverty wasn't a number in a bank account. It was the hum of a refrigerator that worked only half the time and the scent of laundry soap that Lena stretched for an extra week. But for her daughter, Maya, it was a kingdom. Lena had a way of turning hardship into magic. When the power was cut for a night, it wasn't a problem. It was a picnic of stars, and they'd eat sandwiches by candlelight, telling stories that danced in the flickering shadows. Lena worked as a janitor at the local elementary school, her nights spent walking silent, empty hallways, her hands raw from bleach and disinfectant. She scrubbed floors and polished windows, but in her mind, she was composing verses. She taught Maya that poetry wasn't just words on a page, it was a way to build a world bigger than the one you were given. She'd bring home discarded books from the school library, their spines cracked and pages worn, and read to Maya until her voice grew hoarse. In these books, Maya learned about heroes and dragons, but from her mother, she learned about resilience. She'd sometimes catch Lena staring out their small window, her expression a mix of longing and a strange, quiet forgiveness. Maya didn't understand it then, but she knew it was a look reserved for a ghost only her mother could see. That quiet resilience was put to the test. The school board, a group of men in ill-fitting suits who valued budgets over children, decided to expel a young boy for fighting, ignoring the fact he was being mercilessly bullied. Lena, who saw the boy crying in the hallway every day, couldn't stay silent. She spoke up at a board meeting, her voice clear and steady, defending a child who had no one else. What would you have done? Would you risk your job for what's right? Tell me in the comments, fight or stay quiet. The board didn't like being challenged by the janitor. They saw her not as a person, but as a problem. A week later, they offered her a deal in a sterile, windowless office, a check for 3 months' salary and a non-disclosure agreement. Hush money, she later called it. It was enough to fix the refrigerator, to buy Maya new shoes, to breathe for just a moment. But Lena looked at the check, then at the condescending face of the superintendent, and slid it back across the table. My integrity isn't for sale, she said, her voice soft but unbreakable. She was fired the next day. This is where the story could have turned dark. This is where most people would break. But Lena's spirit was forged in a fire men like that couldn't comprehend. She simply found 2 new cleaning jobs, working twice as hard, her body growing tired but her conscience remaining light. But what no one saw, what Lena hid behind her tireless work and gentle smiles, was a betrayal coming from within her own body. It started as a weariness she couldn't shake, a persistent cough she blamed on the cleaning chemicals. Then came the doctor's visit, the hushed tones, the pamphlets with words too clinical for such a human tragedy. She was terminally ill. The diagnosis was a death sentence, a clock that had started ticking without her permission. She didn't tell Maya. How could she? How do you explain to a child whose world is held together by one person that the person is about to disappear? Instead, she began to write. She filled a small worn journal with letters, poems, and memories. It was her final act of love, a way to mother her child from beyond the grave. One entry, written in a shaky hand, read, "He gave me silence, and in that silence, I learned to listen to myself. I pray he one day learns to do the same. Forgiveness, my love, builds taller than towers." The problem was bigger and more personal than anyone could imagine. A woman who had survived a broken heart, poverty, and injustice was now facing the one battle her strength couldn't win. The end came on a quiet Tuesday evening. Lena was sitting in their worn armchair, reading a poem to Maya. Her voice, usually a warm melody, was thin and strained. She was reading a final piece, one she had just written, titled "The Man Who Built Towers." As she read the last line, the book slipped from her fingers. She gasped, a soft, surprising sound, and her head fell back against the chair. Maya, thinking her mother had simply fallen asleep, gently shook her shoulder. "Mama," she whispered. But there was no answer. In her final fleeting breath, Lena's eyes fluttered open one last time, looking at her daughter as if she could pour a lifetime of love into a single glance. She whispered 5 words that would change everything, a key to a door Maya didn't even know existed. Your father, he isn't gone. Then the light in her eyes faded, leaving her daughter alone in the encroaching silence, crying beside her mother's lifeless hand, holding onto a promise she couldn't possibly understand. But what Maya didn't know was that miles away, a man who thought he had nothing left to live for was about to be given a reason. Years passed in a silent, colorless world. Arthur Vale, the man who once commanded skylines, now lived in a sprawling country estate that had become his gilded cage. For a man who had lost his sight, sound became everything. The world was now a library of echoes, the mournful creak of a floorboard, the distant chime of a grandfather clock counting moments he wished he could take back, the hollow echo of his own footsteps in halls too large for one man. He spent his days in a high-backed leather chair, the fabric worn smooth by the ghost of a man. His only connection to his thoughts, his only way of keeping the darkness from swallowing him whole, was a small digital voice recorder. It became his journal, his confessor, his only witness. Log entry, his voice, now gravelly from disuse, would fill the silence. The doctors say my other senses will heighten. They are right. I can smell the rain an hour before it falls. I can hear the heartbeats of birds outside my window. But they failed to mention the one sense that becomes excruciatingly sharp, memory. I remember the exact shade of her eyes when she was sad. I remember the curve of her smile. And I remember the sound of the phone hanging up, the silence she gave me before I left. It's the loudest sound in the world. His only visitor was Henry, a friend from before the empire, a man who still saw the boy from the south side, not the billionaire caricature. Henry would bring him groceries, news from the outside world, and an uncomfortable silence whenever the topic of Vale Industries came up. One crisp autumn afternoon, Henry sat across from him, the clinking of a spoon against a teacup filling the space between them. The company is doing well, Arthur, Henry said, his voice laced with a caution Arthur could feel in the air. Stock is at an all-time high. And the soul? Arthur asked, his head tilted towards the sound. How is the soul of the company, Henry? Henry sighed. They're efficient. The new CEO, Thompson, he runs a tight ship. He's tripled profits. Thompson. Arthur's voice was cold. Thompson was the one who always argued for cutting corners, for prioritizing profit over people. I kept him around to remind myself what not to become. Well, Henry said carefully, he's now running your legacy. He paused, then continued, knowing it was better Arthur heard it from him. There are lawsuits, Arthur. A few of them. Families from that housing project in the East End. They're claiming the company used substandard materials. The ones you personally guaranteed would be top of the line. The news landed like a physical blow. Arthur gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles turning white. The foundation of his empire, the one thing he had been proud of, building homes for those who had none, was now a symbol of the very greed he once claimed to stand against. It was a betrayal of a promise, not just to the public, but to himself. He had built a machine designed to run on ambition, and now it was running right over his own name, his own soul. Have you ever built something with good intentions, only to watch it become the very thing you despise? That night, Arthur didn't sleep. He sat in the darkness, the voice recorder in his hand. Log entry, he whispered, his voice cracking with a pain that was years in the making. She tried to warn me. Lena. She said greatness without gentleness is just noise. My entire life has been noise. I built an empire that survives without me, but it has no heart. I left a woman who was all heart, and she didn't survive me. The world remembers Arthur Vale as a success, but they're mourning the wrong man. The man worth mourning died long before that plane ever went down. He clicked the recorder off, overwhelmed by a wave of guilt so profound it felt like drowning. He had lost everything, but the weight of his regrets was the heaviest burden of all. A week later, Henry arrived with his usual supplies. He found Arthur sitting in the same chair, looking more like a statue than a man. Henry, seeing the depths of his friend's despair, decided to take a risk. I'm going out tonight, he said casually. There's a small charity event in the next town over. A fundraiser. I don't do charity anymore, Henry, Arthur mumbled. I'm a ghost, remember? You're a man sitting alone in a dark house, drowning in memories, Henry countered, his tone gentle but firm. This is different. It's not some high society gala. It's a community thing. In a church basement. They're raising money for the orphan children in the county. No one will know who you are. You can just sit in the back and listen to something other than the ghosts in these walls." Arthur was silent for a long moment. The idea was absurd. But the thought of escaping the suffocating echo of his mansion, of being in a place where the name Arthur Vale meant nothing, it was a flicker of light in the endless dark. A place where he could be anonymous. A place where, for one night, he could be nobody. It was the first thing he had wanted in years. "All right," Arthur said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll go." He had no idea what he was walking into. He thought he was just a blind man looking for a moment of peace, a brief escape from the prison of his own past. He had no idea that he was about to walk directly into his future. He didn't know that in that small, humble church, a little girl was nervously folding and unfolding a piece of paper, preparing to read a poem that would tear down the walls of his carefully constructed darkness and force him, finally, to see. The church wasn't grand. Arthur could tell from the acoustics. The sound was close, intimate, bouncing off what he imagined were plaster walls and wooden pews. The air was thick with the scent of old hymn books, lemon polish, and the cheap, percolated coffee Henry had mentioned. It was the smell of community, of a life so far removed from his own it might as well have been on another planet. Guided by Henry, he found a seat in the back row, the unfamiliar wood of the pew cool and solid beneath his hands. For the first time in 7 years, he was surrounded by people, yet felt completely invisible. He was just a blind man in a borrowed suit, a ghost attending a gathering of the living. He felt a strange sense of peace in the anonymity. It was a lie, of course, but for a moment, it was a comfortable one. A polite smattering of applause brought his attention to the front. A woman with a kind, warm voice was speaking into a microphone. "And now," she announced, "we have a very special performance from a very brave young lady. Please give a warm welcome to Maya Brooks." The name meant nothing to Arthur. He heard the shuffle of small feet on the stage, followed by a nervous tap on the microphone that sent a soft thump-thump through the small sound system. The crowd let out a collective, affectionate sigh. "She can't be more than 8 or 9, Henry whispered, his voice close to Arthur's ear. "She's swimming in a little white dress, holding a piece of paper like it's a winning lottery ticket." Then a voice, small, clear, and trembling with just enough nerves to break your heart, cut through the room. "This poem," she began, the microphone popping slightly on the P, "is for my deceased father." The words struck Arthur with an unexpected force. Deceased father. He felt a pang of morbid irony. He too was a deceased father, a man erased from his own story. He leaned forward slightly, drawn in not by the words themselves, but by the raw, unvarnished emotion in that tiny voice. He settled in to listen to what he assumed would be a child's simple, sad tribute. She began to read, and with the first stanza, the comfortable anonymity Arthur had felt moments before evaporated, replaced by a cold, prickling dread. "My father was a man who built towers," she read, her voice gaining a fragile confidence. "They scraped the clouds and touched the sun's gold fire. He built a world for everyone to see, but he never built a home for my mother and me." Arthur's blood ran cold. It had to be a coincidence, a common metaphor. But his hands, of their own accord, tightened on his cane. His mind flashed back to his penthouse office, the city spread beneath him like a map of his own making. He remembered Lena, standing by the window, looking not at the view, but at him, her eyes pleading for him to see what was right in front of her instead of what lay beyond the glass. Maya took another small, audible breath and continued. He left behind a silence, big and wide, a quiet space where secrets learned to hide. But Mother said that silence has a sound, if you listen for the love that can still be found. She taught me how to hear it in the rain, a gentle whisper that could soothe the pain. This was no longer a coincidence. It was a confession. His confession, spoken by a child he had never met. The words were simple, yet they held the precise poetic weight of Lena's soul. He could almost hear her voice beneath the child's, a ghostly harmony across time. The memory of their last conversation, his hollow promises and her deafening silence, crashed over him. He felt the phantom weight of the phone in his hand, the click of the receiver ending a life he was too blind to see he was destroying. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple. The air in the church suddenly felt thin, suffocating. What was happening? Was he losing his mind? The little girl's voice quavered for a moment, as if she were gathering the strength for the final lines. He could hear the rustle of the paper in her trembling hands. It was the most intimate sound he had ever heard. "And so this poem is not to say goodbye," she concluded, her voice rising with a strength that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her, a strength he recognized. "But just to ask the stars in the night sky, if forgiveness builds a tower tall and true, maybe one day its shadow will reach you." The church was completely still. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, filled with the shared unspoken grief and awe of every person in the room. It was the kind of silence that follows a profound truth. For Arthur, it was the sound of a verdict being delivered. He sat frozen, his entire being locked in a state of suspended shock. He was no longer a ghost. He was a man on trial, and this child was the star witness. The silence was finally broken by a single person clapping, then another, until the small church was filled with a wave of heartfelt, thunderous applause. The sound was a physical assault to Arthur's senses. It was too loud, too real. He felt Henry pat his shoulder, a gesture of shared emotion for a performance whose true meaning Henry couldn't possibly comprehend. Through the applause, Arthur could hear the girl's small footsteps as she walked off the stage. He had to know. The question was a desperate primal need, clawing its way up his throat. He leaned towards Henry, his mouth dry, his own voice a foreign raspy thing. "Henry," he whispered, his voice tight, strained. Who is that child? You said her name was Brooks." Henry, still caught up in the emotional wake of the poem, nodded. "Yes. Little Maya Brooks," he whispered back, his voice thick with sympathy. "Such a tragedy. Her mother passed away last year. A wonderful woman, from what I hear. A literature teacher." He paused, trying to recall the detail an old friend had mentioned. Her name was Lena. Lena. The name wasn't a sound. It was a physical impact. It was a flash of lightning in his endless darkness, illuminating everything in a single brutal, clarifying instant. The poem. The silence. The towers. The forgiveness. It all clicked into place. The universe wasn't mocking him. It was showing him the bill for his life's choices. He didn't need proof. He didn't need a photograph or a birth certificate. The truth was already written in the trembling of his own hands, in the sudden violent hammering of a heart he thought had turned to stone. His grip on his cane went slack. His fingers, numb and useless, let go. The smooth, polished wood slipped, and the cane clattered to the floor, the sharp, percussive sound echoing through the fading applause. To everyone else, it was a minor disruption. A blind man had dropped his cane. But to Arthur, in his silent, pitch-black world, the sound was a gunshot. It was the sound of his carefully constructed reality shattering into a million pieces. It was the sound of a ghost realizing he might not be a ghost after all. The applause in the church faded, but the echo of a little girl's poem and a clattering cane reverberated through Arthur's soul. The drive back to the estate was a blur of sounds. The engine's hum, Henry's concerned questions, the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers against a sudden drizzle, but all Arthur could hear was the name, Lena. Back in the crushing silence of his mansion, the reality of his situation settled in. He had found his daughter, only to realize he had no right to her. But the thought of walking away, of letting her believe he was dead forever, was a pain greater than blindness, greater than the crash itself. He had to try. The next day, guided by a frantic Henry, Arthur returned to the small town. They found the address, a modest house with a peeling blue door and a garden filled with resilient, stubborn weeds. A woman with kind eyes and a spine of steel opened the door. Her name was Mrs. Brooks, Lena's oldest friend and now Maya's legal guardian. Arthur stood on her doorstep, a billionaire reduced to a blind, trembling man holding his cane like a shield. He tried to speak, to explain, but the words caught in his throat, tangled in 7 years of regret. Mrs. Brooks simply stared at him, her expression shifting from confusion to a cold, hard recognition. She had heard Lena's stories, the whispered heartbreaks of a love affair with a powerful man named Vale who had simply vanished. She had held Lena's hand through the lonely nights and had been there when the news of the plane crash had brought a devastating, tragic closure. To her, Arthur wasn't a man seeking redemption. He was a ghost trying to haunt the living. "I know who you are," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Lena spent years learning to live with the silence you left behind. She built a life for her daughter on her own, with her own 2 hands. We don't need your money or your pity now. This child deserves peace, not the storm that follows a man like you. Stay away from her." The words were not shouted. They were delivered with the precise, devastating force of a surgeon's scalpel. Before Arthur could form a single syllable in response, the blue door clicked shut, the sound as final as a coffin lid closing. The rejection was absolute. He had tried to apologize, only to have the door to his past, and his future, slammed in his face. What would you do in that moment? Comment persist if you believe he should fight for his daughter, or let go if you think she's better off without him. That closed door sent Arthur into a spiral. He returned to the mansion not just defeated, but erased. He was a footnote in his own daughter's life, a villain in her guardian's story. The grand estate became a mausoleum of his failures. For days, he refused to eat, barely spoke. The darkness he lived in was no longer just physical, it was a profound, soul-deep void. Henry grew desperate, watching his friend wither away, consumed by a grief that had been delayed for 7 years. Alone in his chair, Arthur clutched his voice recorder. "Log entry," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "She was right. Mrs. Brooks. She was right. I am a storm. I destroyed Lena's peace. What right do I have to disturb her daughters? Maybe this is my penance. To know she exists, and to never be a part of her life. To remain a ghost." It was his darkest hour, a surrender to the abyss. He was ready to let the silence finally win. It was Henry who, in a last-ditch effort, brought him a dusty cardboard box. "I found this in storage," he said, his voice gentle. "It's from Lena. Tapes. From that community college literature course she taught years ago." Arthur initially refused, the thought of hearing her voice too painful to bear. But the silence of the house was louder. That night, with trembling hands, he pushed a cassette into an old player. And then she was there. Her voice, younger, vibrant, filled with a passion for words, filled the cavernous room, chasing away the ghosts. He listened for hours, for days, letting her lectures on poetry and prose wash over him. He heard her dissect metaphors, celebrate sentence structure, and laugh with her students. He was learning everything about her he'd been too arrogant to ask when he had the chance. Then one night, listening to a lecture on themes of forgiveness in literature, he heard her say something that stopped his world. "We often think of forgiveness as something we must earn," her recorded voice explained, clear and thoughtful. "A prize for our penance. But that's not it at all. True forgiveness is a state of grace that already exists, floating in the space between people. It isn't earned by the apologizer, it's found by them. Sometimes, forgiveness is just waiting for you to notice it's already there." The words hung in the air, a lifeline thrown into his darkness. He couldn't earn his way back to Maya. He couldn't force Mrs. Brooks to open that door. But maybe, just maybe, he could build something that Lena would have been proud of. He could create a place where forgiveness was waiting, whether he was there to receive it or not. The next morning, Arthur Vale, the ghost, began the work of coming back to life. He called his lawyers with a newfound clarity. His instructions were simple: liquidate everything that bore his name. The towers, the stocks, the empire of noise. He was going to build something quiet, something that would last. Weeks later, a story appeared on the local evening news. It wasn't about a corporate takeover or a market trend. It was about a new, surprisingly well-funded organization, the Lena Brooks Foundation for Forgotten Families, with a mission to provide grants, housing, and educational resources for single-parent households and orphan children across the state. In the small living room of a house with a blue door, Maya was watching cartoons when the segment came on. She saw a picture of a newly dedicated community center, and beneath it, in large, graceful letters, was her mother's name. "Mrs. Brooks," she called out, her finger pointing at the screen. "That's Mama's name. Why is it on the TV?" Mrs. Brooks came in, her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. The reporter mentioned the foundation's anonymous benefactor, a reclusive philanthropist who wished to honor the legacy of a woman who had taught him the meaning of true wealth. She saw the good it was doing, families being helped, children being supported, and it conflicted with the image of the selfish monster she held in her heart. Driven by a child's unwavering curiosity and a pull she couldn't name, Maya begged to attend the foundation's first public event, a book drive at the newly refurbished town library. Reluctantly, wanting to see this supposed benefactor for herself, Mrs. Brooks agreed. The library was buzzing with a quiet warmth. Arthur stood awkwardly to the side of a small podium, not as a titan of industry, but as a blind man clutching a braille slate. When the time came for him to speak, his voice was unsteady. "I am not a great speaker," he began, "but I wanted to share the words that inspired this foundation." His fingers, scarred but steady, began to move across the raised dots. And he began to read. "My father was a man who built towers." Across the room, Maya froze. She knew those words. They were her words. They were her mother's words. She looked at the man on the stage, his sightless eyes, his vulnerable posture, the way his voice trembled with an emotion she was too young to name but old enough to feel. This wasn't a monster. This was a man in pain. While Mrs. Brooks stood stunned and the crowd listened, captivated, Maya slipped away. She walked with the determined purpose only a child possesses, right up to the stage. Arthur finished the last line and stood in the ensuing silence, his head bowed. He sensed a small presence before him, a shift in the air. Then he heard a voice, small, clear, and impossibly close. "Did you know my mother?" He froze. It was her. He didn't have to see. He knew. This was the moment his life had been reduced to. He took a shaky breath, the air thick with the scent of old paper and the faint, sweet smell of a child's shampoo. He couldn't give her a rehearsed speech or a grand apology. All he had left was the truth. He nodded slowly, a single tear escaping and tracing a path down his cheek. "She was my teacher," he said, his voice cracking, thick with the weight of 7 years of unshed tears. "She taught me everything I was too proud to learn." The answer, so simple and so true, resonated in Maya's heart. It sounded exactly like the mother she missed every single day. Seeing the tear on his cheek, an impulse of pure empathy took over. She reached out her small hand and gently placed it on his, which was still resting on the braille page. For Arthur, the touch was an electric shock of grace. It was warmth. It was connection. It was a bridge across an ocean of silence. In that single, simple gesture from a child he had never known, he felt it. Not earned. Found. The forgiveness that had been waiting for him all along. And for the first time since he had opened his eyes to darkness, Arthur Vale finally, truly, began to see. The touch of his daughter's small hand on his own was a supernova in Arthur's dark world. It was a physical anchor in a sea of regret, a single point of light that held the promise of a new dawn. He heard a soft gasp from nearby, Mrs. Brooks. The crowd in the library began to murmur, sensing they were witnessing a moment far more profound than a simple book drive. In that charged silence, Mrs. Brooks stepped forward, her face a complex tapestry of shock, suspicion, and a dawning reluctant understanding. She looked at Arthur, then at the serene look on Maya's face as she held the hand of this stranger who was no stranger at all, and the walls she had built around her heart began to crumble. There was no confrontation, no anger. There was only the quiet, heavy weight of a truth that had finally found its voice. That evening, the three of them sat in Mrs. Brooks's small living room. Arthur, for the first time, told his story, the crash, the blindness, the years spent as a ghost haunted by a single choice. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He only offered an explanation. Maya sat close beside him, her presence a silent testament to the bridge her poem had built. By the end, Mrs. Brooks looked at him, her eyes glistening. "Lena always believed people could be more than their worst mistakes," she said softly. "It seems she was right about you too." It wasn't absolution, but it was a beginning. A week later, the Lena Brooks Foundation held its official launch event. It was a press conference, a public spectacle Arthur would have once commanded with iron-fisted confidence. Now he stood on the stage, a blind man guided by his 8-year-old daughter, facing a sea of flashing cameras and shouting reporters. The news of his survival had exploded, a media firestorm of disbelief and speculation. The world wanted to know, where had the billionaire been? Why had he returned? Arthur tapped the microphone, and a hush fell over the room. "For 7 years," he began, his voice amplified but steady, "the world believed I was dead. In many ways, you were right. The man who boarded that plane, the man who built an empire of glass and steel, did not survive the crash. I am what is left." He paused, taking a breath. "I once measured my life by the height of my buildings. I thought legacy was something you etched in a skyline. I was wrong. Legacy is what you build in the hearts of others." He then did the one thing no one expected. He publicly acknowledged his greatest failure and his most profound discovery. "I am here today to publicly state that I am the father of Maya Brooks. Her mother, Lena, was the soul of my life, a soul I was too ambitious and too foolish to recognize. I cannot buy back the years I have lost. I cannot undo the silence I created. But I can spend every remaining day of my life honoring the woman who taught me that true wealth isn't what you own, but what you are willing to build for others. He then turned his sightless eyes in the direction of his daughter. This foundation is not mine. It is Lena's. I am merely its first custodian. The room erupted not with questions, but with a wave of stunned, respectful applause. The headlines the next day were simple and staggering. Billionaire found alive, devotes fortune to late lover's legacy. For the first time, they applauded not his wealth, but his courage. The true turning point, however, came at the Foundation's first annual scholarship gala. The hall was filled with families who had been helped, children whose futures were now brighter because of a love story they would never know. The climax of the evening was not a speech from Arthur, but another poem from Maya. She stood at the podium, no longer the timid, trembling girl from the church basement, but a young girl filled with a quiet, powerful grace. I wrote a poem for my father when I thought he was a ghost, she began, her voice clear and strong. Tonight, I want to read one for the man who is here. She unfolded a piece of paper and began to read a new poem, titled, The Man Who Finally Saw. She spoke of a man whose world went dark so his heart could learn to see. She spoke of towers that fell so bridges could be built. She spoke of silence being filled not with absence, but with the sound of a second chance. The words flowed through the hall, a gentle river of healing and hope. The cameras focused on Arthur, who stood beside the stage, his head bowed, tears streaming freely down his face, making no attempt to hide them. He wasn't crying from sadness or regret, but from a sense of overwhelming, undeserved grace. He was listening to his own redemption, sung in the voice of his daughter. It was a full-circle moment. The poem that had begun in grief was now ending in forgiveness. This, he knew, was the true victory. In the years that followed, the Vale Empire faded into memory, but the Lena Brooks Foundation flourished. It launched scholarship programs, built community centers, and provided a safety net for thousands of single-parent families. It became a quiet, powerful force for good, a legacy written not in stone, but in the lives it changed. We see a montage of moments, small and profound. Arthur and Maya, now a teenager, planting a young oak tree in a park dedicated to Lena's memory, their hands covered in rich, dark soil. We see Arthur, sitting in a circle of children at a foundation library, reading a story from a Braille book, his fingers flying across the pages as the children listen, captivated. We see a letter, written in a child's unsteady cursive, pinned to a bulletin board in his office. It reads, "Thank you for helping my mama." His blindness remained, a constant, physical reminder of all he had lost. But emotionally, he was more illuminated than ever. He had learned that true vision has nothing to do with sight. He had learned that some legacies are not built up to the sky, but outward, from one heart to another. The final scene shows an older Arthur sitting with Maya on a park bench, the oak tree they planted now tall and strong behind them. She is reading a book of her mother's favorite poems to him. His face is weathered, peaceful, and marked with a gentle smile. Arthur Vale's towers once reached the clouds, the narration concludes, but his daughter's words reached something far greater, a father's lost heart. He learned the ultimate lesson, that the most valuable thing a man can build is not an empire for the world to see, but a home for his family to feel. As the screen fades to black, we hear the faint archival recording of Lena's voice, clear and timeless, overlapping with the sound of Maya's laughter. Forgiveness, Lena's voice whispers, builds taller than towers. If this story has moved you, and if you believe that everyone deserves a second chance to build a better legacy, subscribe to our channel. There are more stories of hope and redemption waiting to be told.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.